When one is exposed to narcissistic abuse, particularly over long periods, whether in childhood or in romantic entanglements, the psyche doesn't merely suffer, it adapts in ways that can appear strange or unexplainable to the outside world. Freud believed that the ego, caught between the ID and the superego, often molds itself to survive unbearable inner conflict. In victims of narcissists, we see precisely this adaptation. The narcissist, in Freudian terms, is often trapped in a developmental arrest, a fixation at the early narcissistic phase of childhood, where the infant sees itself as the center of the universe. Their partner or victim becomes a projection surface, a psychic mirror, existing only to reflect the narcissist's grandiosity or absorb their shame. For the victim, especially one with a malleable ego, such as a child or emotionally dependent adult, surviving this dynamic often means suppressing one's own identity. What emerges is a personality built on reaction formation, introjection, and displacement, defense mechanisms Freud studied intimately. This is why many victims develop what seem like weird mannerisms to outsiders, chronic over-apologizing. This is not mere politeness. It's the result of internalized guilt placed upon them by the narcissist who projected blame onto them incessantly. The ego, molded by constant accusation, learns to preemptively punish itself. Inconsistent body language. The victim may flinch, avoid eye contact, or even smile while discussing painful events. This is displacement in action, the expression of pain through distorted or inappropriate channels. Obsessive self-monitoring. Freud might say, this is the superego going into overdrive, having lived under the gaze of someone who criticized every word or gesture. The victim's inner voice becomes a tyrant. In all these behaviors, the common thread is survival. The victim doesn't act oddly by choice. They act according to an internal blueprint rewritten by psychological warfare. Freud once noted, "No mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips." In the case of these individuals, the entire body speaks of repressed suffering. To Freud, the human psyche is not merely shaped by external events, but by the way the unconscious processes those events, especially in childhood. Narcissistic abuse doesn't just wound the ego, it programs the superego into becoming a brutal, internal tyrant. One of the most bizarre but telling mannerisms observed in victims is their compulsive need to seek permission for even trivial actions. This habit, often mistaken for politeness, stems from the internalized abuser. Freud described this phenomenon as the introjection of the authority figure. The victim unconsciously absorbs the narcissist's voice and replaces their own judgment with it. Over time, this voice evolves into a pathological superego, one that doesn't guide but punishes. You'll notice it in sudden laughter at inappropriate moments. This isn't nervousness, it's a defense. Freud would say the laughter is a mask to conceal shame or emotional confusion. It's reaction formation, the mind converting pain into its opposite to make it bearable. Perpetual scanning of others' facial expressions. This hypervigilance is the result of long-standing conditioning. The narcissist's mood swings made the victim feel responsible for emotional weather they didn't create. Thus, their body now instinctively tracks every frown, twitch, or sigh, desperate to anticipate danger. Strange stammering or repeated qualifiers, e.g., "If that's okay, I don't know if I'm right." These are not linguistic flaws. They are manifestations of a crushed self. In Freudian terms, the ego has been hollowed by years of conflict between desire and punishment. In victims of narcissists, the ego doesn't trust itself. Every action is double-checked, every sentence filtered through a censor. What Freud called the superego ideal, the mental image of how we believe we should be, has become poisoned. Instead of aspiring toward virtue or strength, the victim aspires to simply not upset anyone. This inner war often results in a bizarre emotional paralysis. The victim may cry when praised or freeze when treated kindly. In Freud's framework, this is neurotic guilt, a subconscious belief that pleasure or validation must be punished. The narcissist planted this belief like a virus, and now the ego flinches even in safety. Such strange behaviors are not signs of weakness, but of internal bondage. Freud reminds us, the voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. The question is, how long must the victim suffer before that voice breaks through? If one were to observe closely, they might label the behavior of a narcissistic abuse survivor as odd or overly sensitive. But from a Freudian lens, these mannerisms are the visible residue of powerful defense mechanisms. The psyche's unconscious efforts to survive overwhelming emotional trauma. Freud believed the mind protects itself from unbearable conflict through various psychological defenses. In victims of narcissistic abuse, these defenses become chronic, shaping not only thought but behavior, movement, and even voice. What seems weird to the casual observer is in truth a deeply intelligent, albeit unconscious, form of psychic protection. Let us examine 3 of these mechanisms. Dissociation, the mind's emergency. Exit a common and disconcerting trait among those abused by narcissists is the tendency to zone out or become emotionally absent in conversations. This isn't rudeness. It is dissociation, a splitting of conscious awareness, a retreat inward. Freud never used the modern term dissociation, but he understood its root as a division of the ego. The abused person, especially in childhood, learned to detach during emotional overwhelm. It was safer to float into fantasy than to remain in the chaos of the narcissist's manipulations. This survival skill now manifests as sudden blank stares, poor memory recall, or even a feeling of watching oneself from outside the body. Reaction formation, when kindness masks. Rage. Have you ever met someone excessively sweet, almost unnaturally so? This can be a result of reaction formation, a defense where a person exhibits the opposite of what they truly feel. Freud observed that when unacceptable feelings, like anger toward a parent, were too dangerous to express, the psyche would disguise them under a mask of their opposites. In abuse survivors, this may appear as forced smiles, compulsive caregiving, or excessive agreeableness. These traits are not genuine personality features. They are psychic disguises developed to keep the abuser's wrath at bay. The real self, the one that wants to scream or set boundaries, is trapped behind the curtain of pleasantries. Projection and hyper-awareness victims often anticipate others' moods before they're even expressed. While this may seem intuitive or empathetic, Freud would view it as a form of projection, not of one's feelings onto others, but of others' feelings onto the self. This can create bizarre behaviors, such as apologizing for things one didn't do, or avoiding eye contact even when nothing is wrong. The victim becomes like a tuning fork, vibrating with emotions that aren't theirs. This is the legacy of years spent absorbing the narcissist's displaced rage, guilt, and shame. These unconscious maneuvers are not mental illness, they are mental armor. Strange habits, nervous tics, apologetic laughter, they are relics of inner wars, where the ego bent and twisted but did not break. Freud taught that to understand a person's behavior, we must look beneath it, into the dreamlike terrain of the unconscious. Only then do the weird mannerisms begin to speak their true language. To the casual eye, the survivor of narcissistic abuse may appear confused, scattered, even self-sabotaging. But in Freud's world, this is not mere dysfunction. It is repetition, compulsion, inaction. the unconscious reenactment of unresolved trauma. Freud noted that the patient behaves as if he were experiencing something that was happening now, even when the original danger has long since passed. This psychic loop, this compulsion to repeat, is not driven by pleasure or logic, but by an inner drive to master the trauma that once overwhelmed the ego. And it's in this compulsion that many of the weird behaviors of the abused begin to make terrifying sense. Choosing familiar pain. Why abuse survivors often attract similar partners. The survivor of narcissistic abuse often ends up in relationships that mirror their original trauma. They might say, "I keep ending up with controlling or critical people," as though fate itself is cruel. But Freud would suggest that it is not fate, it is the unconscious at work. The psyche, ever trying to resolve what was once unbearable, repeats the past with the hope of a different outcome. It's not madness, it's logic, dream logic. That wounded inner child still seeks approval from the same archetype that once denied it. So the survivor unconsciously gravitates toward narcissistic personalities, compelled to re-script the trauma with a better ending. Unfortunately, this rarely happens, and the cycle deepens. Hypervigilance. When the world feels like a minefield, Freud's signal anxiety theory explains the ever-present sense of dread many survivors carry. Their mannerisms, flinching at loud voices, checking texts obsessively, becoming paralyzed by decision-making, are not overreactions, but alarms sounding from the unconscious. The ego, having once endured repeated psychic injury, becomes like a sentry on high alert. Any shift in tone, silence, or facial expression may signal danger. This is why even casual conversations can trigger rehearsed apologies or defensive laughter. The abused psyche, having once survived in a landmine-laden emotional battlefield, now sees threats where none exist, just in case. Emotional flashbacks, reliving, without remembering. Here is one of the strangest and saddest mannerisms. A person breaking down, becoming childlike or suddenly aggressive over seemingly trivial moments. Freud didn't have the modern language for this, but he described it through abreaction, the sudden discharge of repressed emotions. These aren't tantrums or mood swings. These are emotional flashbacks. The body remembers what the conscious mind has forgotten. A tone of voice, a gesture, a phrase, and suddenly the survivor is 8 years old again, facing the cold gaze of the narcissist. This regression often results in behaviors society finds awkward or disproportionate, yet from the unconscious viewpoint, they are utterly appropriate. When Freud looked at the human being, he saw not only what is, but what once was. Every odd gesture of the narcissistic abuse survivor is a whisper from a past self. One trapped in time, still running, still hiding, still trying to be loved. The world may call it weird. Freud would call it unfinished business. To Freud, healing is not simply about knowing what happened. It is about becoming conscious of what drives us. And for the survivor of narcissistic abuse, the path forward lies not in denying their strange behaviors, but in decoding them. As Freud famously said, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. It is this honesty, this ruthless self-observation, that separates those who heal from those who remain stuck in the cycle. The internalized tyrant, how the narcissist lives on. Inside the victim, one of the most tragic outcomes Freud identified is the formation of a cruel superego, an internal voice that echoes the abuser long after they're gone. The survivor may have left the narcissist, but they continue to punish themselves, criticize themselves, and deny themselves joy. The mannerism, constant second-guessing, unrelenting self-criticism, feeling guilty for setting boundaries or saying no. Freud would say, This is the narcissist's voice, internalized and now masquerading as your conscience. It's no longer the abuser holding the whip, it's you. Dreams of rebellion, the subconscious, yearning for freedom. Freud placed great emphasis on dreams, calling them the royal road to the unconscious. Survivors often report vivid, surreal dreams of running, hiding, being watched, or even confronting their abuser. These are not random, they are psychic signals. These dreams reflect the ego's struggle with the past. Sometimes the survivor fights back in the dream, something they couldn't do in real life. Freud would interpret this as the psyche's attempt to reclaim agency. The dream is not just a dream, it is rehearsal for liberation. Reclaiming the self, making the unconscious conscious. Healing, in the Freudian sense, is not the absence of pain. It is the integration of pain into the self. The abused individual, once fragmented and buried under layers of shame, must excavate their identity from beneath the rubble of narcissistic manipulation. This is why survivors often adopt new rituals: journaling, art, long walks, or periods of solitude. They may change their wardrobe, voice, or even handwriting. These are not affectations, they are symbolic acts of rebirth. Freud would say, the ego is reasserting itself after years of oppression. The return of agency, from victim to analyst, of one's own mind. Perhaps the most powerful transformation is when the survivor begins to observe their own behaviors, not with shame, but with curiosity. They ask, why did I react that way? Whose voice am I hearing? Is this fear mine, or was it planted in me? This shift from passive victim to active analyst of one's psyche is where the Freudian journey truly begins. For in that moment, the person ceases to be haunted and begins to haunt their trauma. They become the hunter, not the hunted, the subject, not the object. In conclusion, the weird mannerisms of those abused by narcissists are not merely eccentricities. They are symptoms of survival, codes of pain, and attempts at self-reconstruction. Freud would not mock these behaviors. He would invite the individual to explore them, to follow the thread of the symptom back to the original wound, because in that wound lies the truth, and in that truth lies freedom.